Okay, good morning everyone and welcome to our Wednesday morning online seminar. Today we are looking at the Brexit effect, courtesy of Jon Sharp, consultant solicitor with Silver Shermings Ash. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Julie. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. In the sunny wilds of Scotland there. Okay, as always, if you have any questions for John, I have a feeling there may be a few on this topic. Please feel free to use the Q&A or the chat tools in the bottom toolbar. Submit your questions to John and he will answer as many of them as possible. If there's something specific you wish to ask, you're always free to email him directly. His details will be on the screen shortly, but for ease, it's Jon Sharp, that's Jon Sharp, @silverllp.com. Okay, John, without any further ado, we will hand over to you and the joys of the Brexit effect.
Well, thank you very much, Julie. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, apologies for looking like an Elvis impersonator this morning, but it's the best I can do with my hair. I did have a cut before Christmas, but that's been a while ago. Now, Brexit. This was something that we all hotly debated, if everyone remembers, PC, pre-COVID days. Far less so recently, it has to be said. And I'm trying to try my very best to keep politics out of this talk. But obviously, to some extent, you can't disassociate Brexit from politics completely. That's me, less said about him, the better. Details are all on the website. So we'll just move on. In terms of an agenda today, we are going to just have a quick look at a little history. It just explains a few things in the current circumstances. I think it helps. Have a very quick look at the Brexit trail, deal or no deal, so what the main items of the deal are. Then we'll turn to construction specific issues. I know that many of you are from the construction industry, so we'll have a look at these. And two of the main ones, without any shadow of a doubt, are logistics and labour. And then I just thought at the end, just for a little bit of, to just emphasise that things have really changed. We'll have a look at was it worth buying that house abroad, followed by some very limited conclusions from me, and I'll take any questions if there are any. Just a little history. The EU, well, in those days, the European Economic Community was built out from, came from the Scandinavian model. In the 1930s, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden all effectively became, I don't know, philosophically, they decided to have a grand compromise. So they decided not to put national interests ahead of cooperating, and in particular, they entered into agreements which allowed a free trade zone between those countries. Then, of course, the Second World War came about, and some countries in Europe looked at the Scandinavian model and thought, oh, that might work for us down here. That might be quite good. So, Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Luxembourg, and Netherlands in the 1950s all entered into a coal and steel collective agreement, so that they would effectively share coal and steel production between them all on a free trade basis. And this developed into 1957 when we had the Treaty of Rome, and then from the 1960s, once that treaty was fully implemented, those countries all started trading with each other with no custom duties and became a free trade zone. Now, this was looked at by England and by Ireland with slightly envious eyes. We quite like the idea of a free trade zone with no tariffs between goods, etc. But unfortunately, when we made overtures to join, a certain Charles de Gaulle, who apparently hated us, wouldn't let us join. So we had to wait, unfortunately, until Charles de Gaulle died before the EU would consider our application to join. Of course, we then know that Ted Heath invited the country through a referendum to join what was and remains a free trade zone. Let me just explain to you in the words of my father. I'm lucky enough to have an 87-year-old father who's still compos mentis, and remembers all this at the time. And indeed, I remember sitting in his car listening to some European debate on the radio, and I asked my father whether or not he was going to vote to join the EU. Now, you see, my father then was a simple tradesman. Well, I say that, he was involved in the medical profession, and he worked for an American company. And that American company provided shunts, which in particular helped those suffering from spina bifida, and also, more importantly, filters, which reduced the amount of time that you had to be in a dialysis unit by 6 to 8 hours. Now, my dad, obviously, there was a demand for not only these filters in England, but also in Europe. But what my father was having to do was having to import the goods from America. That involved customs paperwork and some tariffs as well. And then once he got them to England, he had to do exactly the same again to send them into Europe. So he had to have paperwork, customs, etc. And the problem with it was, as my father explained to me at the time, that sometimes things go wrong. You've got the customs paperwork wrong, it causes delay, and it's not good. So the prospect of my father effectively only having to do this once, so that when the goods came into England, and not have to do it when he sent the goods to the rest of Europe, was exceptionally appealing to him. So he wanted to join, and voted to join, as he said, a free trade zone. When I asked him why he was now going to vote to leave the EU, having voted to join a free trade zone back in the 70s, he said, well, something along the lines of, I didn't vote to have all the paraphernalia that came with it. And as we know, that paraphernalia, as my father put it, caused increasing disillusion in England. Ladies and gentlemen, just excuse me a second. I'm just going to shut my blind because I can't see. Very sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen, but at least you can tell it's live. So we had a referendum. David Cameron called a referendum. And as we all know, we voted to leave the EU. And we had to give 2 years' notice. There was great anger about us having to give 2 years' notice, but realistically, I'm not quite sure what everybody else expected. You look at it just from a divorce perspective. If you've been married a very short period of time, so a couple, 2 or 3 months, and suddenly you realize that the person you married is absolutely completely different to the person that you thought you married, and you just want to end your marriage quickly, the courts don't really interfere at all. There's no children to sort out, there's no joint assets, you just want to get divorced. And now in these days of no-fault divorce, that will be a very, very quick process with very little interference from the court. However, the longer you've been married, the more the courts have to get involved to sort things out. So they have to sort out issues with regard to the children. What are you going to do with joint assets? Are you going to sell the former matrimonial home? Where are you going to live? And having been in the EU for close to 45 years, a very similar process had to be gone through. Well, what are we all going to do now? As you know, the 2-year notice period was extended, and eventually an agreement was reached, and then we finished the transition year. So did we in the end get a deal, or was it no deal? Well, we got a deal. At the last minute, of course, I'm quite sure that if you'd gone to a bookies and said, oh, I want 10 to 1 on it being done 4 days before the time period extended, the bookies would have said, oh, no, we're not doing that. Because it was as certain as eggs is eggs that it was going to go right to the wire. But what are the two main things that have really come out of this? Well, in effect, having looked at, and it is a vast, vast area, there are two areas where there is going to be real change, which I think everyone is going to notice. We have our borders back. On that, there is no doubt, for reasons that I will explain later. Also, we have our laws back. There is not going to be any automatic right to appeal to the European Court of Justice or the European Court of Human Rights. Now, that might still be a route. But certainly, the Supreme Court here will now have the final say. We will pass our own laws and will not have to necessarily follow EU legislation, etc. But I don't know about you, but at the moment, it all seems very curiously quiet. I know I went to the supermarket the other day and I managed to get my strawberries from Italy and my oranges from Italy. So I'm not really sure what is everyone saying, what's all the fuss about? What's really going to happen? Well, I think it's curiously quiet for reasons that I will come back to. We are obviously all still in lockdown, as is most of Europe. Trade between us and Europe is at about 50 to 60% of normal levels. So as they were in, say, March 2019. We won't really feel the effects, I don't think, until we get back to a certain amount of normality. And normality, I think, on any view is probably not going to be till about September. And Europe is bound to be 3 to 4 months behind us because of the issues they've had with their vaccination program. And so realistically, you're looking at probably March of next year before you can start comparing like with like. So let's look at some construction specific issues. What I think there's going to be problems with going forward. Well, first of all, regulation. Is there going to be an increase or a decrease in the amount of red tape, compliance with EU regulations, UK regulations? Is it going to go up or go down as a result of leaving the EU? Well, I suppose the good news is that any new regulations will come from one source, and that will be the UK government. We will not have, and nobody will have to look to Europe to see what they're doing and whether we're going to have to be compliant with that. Any new legislation will come directly from the UK government by way of either statutory instrument or Act of Parliament, and that is what you will be expected to follow. Does it mean, though, that you can now stop complying with any EU regulations to apply for businesses? Well, the answer is no, because most of the EU regulations, take, for example, the Data Protection Act, have all been incorporated into English law by Act of Parliament. And indeed, in relation to the DPA, our Act went further than the European regulation. So it doesn't mean that you can ignore EU regulations, etc., simply because they will not be repealed. There are no plans to wholesale repeal all the EU regulations that are in force. That's not going to happen. They'll be tinkering around the edges. There might be some relaxation of certain rules and there might be some changes, but all those will take time. It's not going to happen overnight. So you can't ignore any EU regulations that you're complying with, because in effect, they will have force of English law. Also, it is very likely that if there is new EU legislation, that the UK government will follow it. What it wants to make sure is that there is a level playing field between the two, between ourselves and Europe. And therefore, if Europe still passes a makes a new regulation, the chances are that we will in some way, shape or form follow it. So I think there will be gradually a decrease though in regulation, and at least it will now only come from one source. Next point is obtaining goods and materials. The jury's slightly out on this one at the moment, but by being part of a free trade zone, exporting and importing between UK and EU, etc., was easy. There were no customs forms to fill out. There were no tariffs to worry about. There was very little to worry about. And therefore, put yourself in the, say you're a German manufacturer and you've got to supply some specialist steel parts. Sending it to the UK is easy. You just put it on a lorry and, oh, it's off. Thank you very much. So if that company had a competing order from, say, I don't know, America, it would probably deal with the British one first because it's easy. I haven't got to worry about anything. Made it, put it on the lorry, send it. Now it's got to fill out customs forms. It has to make declarations. It has to do tariffs. So, are they still going to prefer us, or are they going to go to maybe to America? This has certainly been the case in relation to Scandinavian wood items at the moment. Are they going to go to America first, or are they going to send it to England first? Because now there is an additional complexity in exporting goods to us. The answer is I'm not sure. I think it's a watch this space situation. And obviously, existing contractual relationships that you have with suppliers in Europe should continue unaltered. But only time's going to tell. And I suspect that there may well be difficulty in the future in obtaining goods and materials at either preferential speed or at the same rate as you were able to obtain them before. Finding labour, yes, that is definitely going to be an issue going forward, and I'll come on to that in a minute. Same with logistics. There are going to be issues there going forward, and I'll come on to them as well. And then let me just touch on the question of recovering monies owed. When I first started law back in 1986, the Civil Jurisdiction and Judgments Act had just come into force. Now, the Civil Jurisdiction and Judgments Act was a revolutionary act. What it meant was that if a German court had found that an English company owed a German company money, what that German court could do was simply send a request to the English courts and, or through an English lawyer, have that judgment registered in the UK. Now, the English courts lost the power, as indeed did the German courts, vice versa, to interfere with that decision. As long as it was a final decision of that German court, and okay, one or two other minor exceptions, then it wasn't up to the English court to go back into the whys and the wherefores of the case. It was simply register the judgment, and therefore the judgment could be enforced in this country in the same way as any other judgment or any UK judgment. And it was the same for us in Europe. We got a decision from the English courts that a French company owed us money. We would simply then instruct a French lawyer, the judgment would get registered, and the French lawyer would seek to enforce that judgment in the same way as they could do here. And this, if you like, created a level playing field between all the countries of the EU. Companies knew, no matter what state they were in the EU, that frankly, it is possible for an English company quite easily and quite quickly to enforce a judgment against it, and vice versa. So it made everyone, if you like, play nicely together. Things got paid. There were, yes, of course, there were disputes, but you could sort them out reasonably amicably because you all knew that ultimately someone might come knocking at your door to enforce recovery of that money. Now, that may well go. It's too early days yet to say precisely how it will go, but I can well see a situation where we'll go back to the old days, where when you get a judgment against, say, a French company in this jurisdiction, the French courts start opening up that decision again to see whether it was decided correctly, whether it would have been decided differently under French law, etc. Now, I can't say for certain that that's what's going to happen, but it is something that you need to bear in mind, because it is perfectly possible that, given the now distinction between ourselves and Europe, that the European courts may well start to look at English judgments differently. And those in the construction industry who've got supply chains in Europe, etc., need to be aware of that. It may not be as easy as it was to obtain your money and your funds. Logistics. I've already been asked a question about whether there will be port delays, and I'll answer that as neatly and as succinctly as I can in a moment. There is definitely now a border. You might not see it because certain goods, in particular wood, which is important to the construction industry, it seems to be going to be cleared in warehouses to ensure that it complies with EU regulations. And there will actually be a physical border. We all heard the saber rattling that went on from the EU with regard to the Northern Irish border, a problem that I am not going to look into today because it's extremely complicated. But you can well see that if our relationship with Europe deteriorates, that Europe is not going to necessarily be backward in coming forward when it comes to enforcing the position. So what exactly is the new trade deal with regard to logistics, transportation, etc.? Well, under the EU and UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement, it only allows for duty-free movement of goods between the UK and the EU if the goods originated in either the UK or the EU. Anything else is going to be subject to tariffs. So if it was made somewhere other than the UK or the EU, it will be subject to tariffs. You now have to certify, logistic companies have to certify that the goods originated in the UK. All logistics companies have to have an economic operator's registration and identification number so that they can certify the goods originated in the UK or didn't, case may be, and can also complete the necessary customs and tariff forms. There will need to be customs declarations prepared and done. And shortly, the additional paperwork and, as my father said, going back to the 70s, the ability for it to have been done wrong or to be not completed correctly is going to cause issues and possible delay. With regards to delay, at the moment, as we're operating at about 50 to 60% of normal stuff, it's all going swimmingly at the moment. And it's a good period, really, to be fair, for logistic companies. They need to adjust to the new system, and operating at 50 to 60% of normal at the moment will give them time to get all their systems in place, to get used to the new system, etc. And probably in 6 to 8 months' time, they won't even remember the old days when we didn't have to do any of this. But at the moment, is there the potential there for delay? The answer is yes. And remember, we're only operating at 50 to 60% of normal. And remember, there's no people. So at the moment, mainly it's freight that's moving. Soon we'll have people in the mix again. And you know what people have the tendency to do when they all get together and start traveling? Things go wrong. So I would be very careful about delay. I think it may well become a real problem. So what can you practically do about delay? Well, I would have thought the most important thing was to build in some additional time into your contracts. I'm not saying it will need to be vast amounts of time, but I would give yourself some leeway. I'd put something in that gives you just a little bit more time if you're going to be relying in your construction project on goods coming in from Europe. I would just put that in. Plan in advance as well. Don't leave things to the last minute. Make sure your orders are in. You're importing goods for your construction project from Europe. Make sure your orders are in good time so that there can be any delay can be mitigated. And lastly, look at insurance. You can buy goods in transit insurance, which will cover you for delay. Now, at the moment, it's not been wasn't certainly taken up very much, but I think it might well come back into favour. And at the moment, because there aren't any delays, I don't suspect it's desperately expensive. But think about getting some goods in transit insurance. It will cover you, may not cover you for the entire cost of the delay, but it will give you something back. It may well be worth thinking about. If you speak to a good broker, they'll be able to advise you further on that. Is there going to be additional cost and expense? Well, I think everyone has decided that the cost of goods is probably going to rise between 3 to 4%. And will there be an additional expense in transport? Well, yes, because everyone may need, in due course, a customs broker. Because what is the situation whereby you import something from, say, Germany, 90% of which was made in Germany, but 10% came from Korea? Problem. That 10% is going to have to go through customs clearance, and you'll need a customs broker for that. In terms of where you can find questions and answers and a very useful website, if you look at DSV, Global Transport and Logistics website, it is very good. Yes, of course, they're saying, oh, come to DSV, we can sort your problems out. But in terms of answering questions, they've got a Q&A session that you can go and ask them, and they're very good, and they've responded very well to all the queries. And no, if you go on their website, they don't, to quote E17, say, all right, everything's going to be all right. They don't say that. They anticipate problems, not quite so much at the moment, but in the future. So I would strongly recommend having a look at DSVs. It's good. Yes, as I said, they do say DSV can solve problems of the world, but it's a good starting point if you want to know what is likely to happen going forward in relation to the transportation of goods into Europe. Also, remember that some items that you may be importing will require some form of specialist transport. Now, because the demand for specialist transport, despite the fact that the construction industry has stayed open more than other parts of the economic sector, specialist transportation vehicles, etc., are on the decrease. People haven't renewed them because there hasn't really been the demand. So again, if you're going to be importing large kit that needs to be brought to the site intact in one piece, and you need specialist transportation vehicles to do that, make sure you book that vehicle in advance. There will be, I suspect, potential shortages whilst people either build back up their fleet or take out of effectively mothball the specialist vehicles that they have got. Labour. Now, there was already, and I don't think there's any point in trying to hide this, a skills shortage within the construction industry. And these new rules are not, in my view, likely to help that. There was a shortage because of an aging employee population. I think it's something like 15% of people now employed in construction are over 60. I'm going to have to be very careful what I do now here. The construction industry is, well, there's a general perception that maybe gender equality remains a bit of an issue within the construction industry. But most importantly, probably it's not seen as being particularly attractive, or the construction industry hasn't made itself particularly attractive to young people. You don't see the adverts on television like you do for other industries saying, come come and work in construction because it's very exciting. You can do this, that, the other, etc., etc. Which of course it can do, but we don't advertise it enough. So we have a lack of young people coming into the industry to replace those that are retiring. And also, there's a perception by young people that the construction industry really doesn't use what their key skills are, which of course is the digital age. Yes, I know now what you use lasers and flashing things all over the place to build buildings, but they don't know that, and we don't advertise it. Therefore, there is a lack of people coming in. So how did the construction industry deal with that? It used migrant labour. Between 1996 and 2019, 60% of the net employment growth was from migrant workers coming to work in this country. Since the referendum, that's fallen by nearly 2/3. And there has been an exodus of workers during the pandemic. And I suspect that exodus may continue because the new rules really do not make life any easier. I spent some time whilst I was preparing for this talk, looking at the government's website on, well, how can you come to the UK, etc. Well, it took me a long time to fathom it out, and I suspect really to understand it, you need a degree in employment law because it is very complicated. There is no two ways about it. You can't say it's simple. It's not. It is a points-based system. Effectively, it means that the UK is choosing, and there's no other way around it, who it's going to now let into the country. And primarily all it wants is skilled workers. But unfortunately, as far as I could see in the new regulations, there was no definition of skilled. I would have thought that was a fairly obvious point to start off with in any new legislation, but I couldn't find it. I assume that a fully qualified, for example, plumber who will be classed as a skilled worker, but really, I'm not sure. And you have to, for the most part, be sponsored. There is a minimum wage that you're going to be earning here, which is about 26,000. Unless, of course, you're a highly skilled worker, and there's no real definition of highly skilled worker either, in which case it seems that you can come at any time. There's also a global talent route, and a startup and innovator route. But let's put it this way: if I'm sitting abroad and I'm thinking, oh well, I'll go to England because I know their construction industry is booming, I think I'll be able to provide my services there. And then I take one look at the rules for coming to this country, I'd be thinking, maybe not. Let's go and have a look at another country, shall we? Because it really is not easy. And with the sponsorship of jobs being necessary, I can see that leading to increased costs within the construction industry because you're going to have to possibly sponsor people to come. And I think the government to some extent realizes that this is not going to be the easiest problem to solve, and therefore is planning to do far more and sponsor, I think, part of more training and apprentices programs, so that people can get the additional labour that they need. In addition, by the way, if you're coming to this country, you have to speak English now. That's now mandatory. You have to prove you can speak English by either demonstrating that you're educated in English, you come from an English-speaking country, or that you've got an academic degree that would talk in English. The net result of all of this, I suspect, is it's going to get worse before it gets better. So I suppose practical advice must be that you need to consider project size. Are you going to have the additional labour that you need to do large projects? Because under this new system, it is going to take longer to get skilled people into the country. I suppose the one thing that I would say is that if you do have skilled workers from abroad now, You really don't want them leaving because they suspect they will be like gold dust going forward. So please bear that in mind. There will be a significant change in the availability of getting labour in. So with all this, with borders up, etc., was it worth buying that house abroad? Well, there are new rules from the 1st of January 2021. You can now only spend 90 days out of 180 days in Europe. That's 90 days anywhere in Europe. So 3 months anywhere. So if you've bought your holiday home in Spain, yeah, you can go there for 3 months, but then you've got to come away again. And lots of people planned, I suspect, when they bought their villas, etc., to maybe have the winter months in Spain. Perfect sense. Can't do that anymore. Got to come back. So it's 90 days in any country in Europe. For 6 months in any year in the whole of Europe. There has, as you can probably imagine, been a rush to apply for dual residency in European countries. If you get dual residency, you can go there for as long as you like. So bear that in mind. Now, does anyone remember travelling? I've frankly forgotten about that. When you can travel again, we will be joining the non-EU queue, I'm afraid. That's been put into tablets of stone. Your duty-free allowances, well, booze cruises to France will now be a thing of the past because duty-free allowances will change. And what is also very likely to change are mobile tariffs. At the moment, I think there was an EU court ruling that said they can't charge you more for going from one country to another. So watch your downloads on the sunbeds because mobile tariffs will soon be back at their usual extortionate rate. Conclusion? Well, my conclusion is that it's a little bit early really to test how much the new agreement's going to affect matters because we're only operating at 50 to 60% at the moment. But I think there will be potential problems going forward, in particular with regard to delay at ports, etc. I think labour is going to be a real issue going forward, no matter what. But we won't really know until we get back to comparative trade and travel levels as we experienced in, say, March of 2019. And that is some way off. The only consolation for that is that certainly as far as logistics are concerned, they have got a longer period to get used to the system before they get absolutely run off their feet again. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that was all I was going to say. I do hope that that's been useful. That's a summary. There is plenty of reading about this on the net. But as I said, if you want to find more about logistics, I would certainly recommend the DSV site. It's very good, it's interactive, and it's very clear and understandable. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention this morning. Thank you.
Thanks, John. That was really interesting. And I've just put up in the chat panel a link to the DSV website, including important information on how to avoid delays, so people can go and have a look at that. Great. If anyone's got any questions, now is the time to ask. Otherwise, as we say, please feel free to contact John directly, Jon Sharp. Jon Sharp at silverllp.com. We have a question in. Someone's asking, with the reduction of labour, is it considered that the scale of the construction industry will recede?
Well, that's a very good question. I don't think the government wants it to recede, is the short answer. I think it wants a strong construction industry. I think what will happen, or what I hope will happen, is that various construction industry bodies will actively lobby the government if the labour shortage continues. As I said, there was a skill shortage anyway before we left the EU, and that's not going to go away either. And I think eventually the construction industry and the bodies will lobby the government to say, you need to do something about this. We need to be able to get more workers in. to carry out the construction projects that you want us to do. So hopefully there won't be a contraction. But I do see it, of all the issues, I see that one as being the biggest problem for the construction industry. It is, I could not believe it. I'll be 100% honest with everyone when I looked at the government guidance at just how complicated it is. It's not easy. And if I was abroad looking at this, I'd be thinking, I think I might look somewhere else.
Okay. Someone else is saying, do you envisage a push to promote MMC, which would see labour force being moved into factories rather than on-site works?
I'm not sure it's, in terms of new people coming in, I'm not sure it's going to make that much difference, to be honest. As I said, the problem that we have with all of this is again, it is uncertainty. As a construction industry, you need to plan for your labour demands for doing your various jobs. At the moment, it's going to be very difficult for you to know whether you'll get that labour. And certainly one commentator, one article I read from a small, well, medium-sized construction company, their managing director, she said, we are not taking on big projects. We are taking on what we know we can do. And I don't think whether it matters whether it's factory-based or not. The problem at the moment is that there is going to be uncertainty about the labour supply, and prudent companies, I think, will say, okay, we know we can do that with our existing resources. We'll do that one. Whereas they won't stretch themselves, go and do the bigger projects, which will effectively lead to a lack of competition for the bigger projects, because they'll think, well, we may not be able to get the people in to do it.
Okay. So I was just saying, would you see the shift to modular construction, fabricating large modules in Europe and importing to the UK, would be a potential consequence?
Yes, I think it might well be a potential consequence, yes. I think,
okay.
I mean, it's been the same as well. This customs thing is not easy either. Say you're constructing bathroom pods in this jurisdiction, yeah? And most of the construction materials that go into making bathroom pods is either made in the UK or has come from Europe. That's fine. There's no issues there. That's okay. There's no tariffs. It's all fine. But just say that, I know the pipe work comes from, as I said earlier, Korea. That's going to be a real nightmare. And are you going to have to then just dump that and pay for more expensive pipe work, which is going to increase the cost of your bathroom pods? I don't know. There's some real problematic areas that I think are going to develop over time. As I said, at the moment, because we're at 50–60% capacity, these problems are not really coming to the fore, but they will when we're all running about the place like headless chickens again in March of 2022.
Okay. Someone else is saying, can you provide an update on OJEU requirements in public procurement? Do these still apply and will they eventually be phased out?
I do like an easy
yes
question
no?
in the morning. Okay, as I said earlier, what you think you've got, the current position with regard to procurement rules, etc., 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 may change over time. But any rules that applied, the safest way to approach it is that any rules that applied to you as of the 30th of December 2020. So before we'd done the deal, when we were in the transition year, and therefore all EU regulations, etc., all still applied, assume they still do now. And that will include in procurement rules, etc. Now, over time, I am quite sure that a lot of these rules will change. One of the things that the government is particularly keen to do is to make Britain a good place to do business. And therefore, as a result, it will make changes to try and make Britain more attractive. And I dare say on the procurement side as well, it will try and make things slightly easier rather than harder. But do you still have to stick with the existing rules at the moment? The answer is yes, you do. But watch this space, because over time, gradually, especially when we're COVID tolerant, I think sure will ever be free, COVID tolerant, there will be, I suspect, quite a lengthy legislative programme to effectively change parts of the legislation, including the procurement process, which the government isn't particularly keen on.
Okay. Again, going back to your earlier point about labour shortages, if labour shortage causes big issues, will construction firms not lobby the government for overseas skills? For example, seasonal worker visa has quickly been introduced in the agriculture industry.
I think that's what's going to, I do think that's what's going to happen. I think the construction industry will lobby the government and say, look, this is really unfair on us. We need workers of this type. We're going to have to introduce some system whereby we can have temporary workers on visas. I do think that's going to happen because the system, I don't think, the government may well say, well, that's fine, but if you're importing skilled workers, they've still got to go through the process.
Mm.
And if it's a skill shortage that the construction industry is lacking, but I think it's going to, I think all this is doing is making it lack both. It's making it lack the ability to have just pure labourers, and also it's going to make it harder for it to get skilled workers. So it's going to face, I think, a double whammy. And I think the construction industry will lobby the government and say, you're going to have to do something about this. We can't operate like this.
Okay. Right, that seems to be the end of the questions. Thank you very much, everyone who's attended and logged on this morning. It's always nice to see you all virtually, obviously. Jon, thank you so much for your time. It's a big topic, and I know we're going to do a refresh later in the year when more of the effect may be seen on the points that you've covered this morning. So thank you very much. We are online again this evening with Richard Silver, another one of his construction essentials, where he's covering contract interpretation and damages at large. If anyone would like to log on for that, just drop me an email, seminars@silverllp.com, and I'll send you the login details. Other than that, thank you again, Jon, for your time, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you, Julie. Always nice to see you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Bye-bye.